Hey folks, in today's video I'm going to be analyzing a game submitted via our Patreon page, and this game is going to give us a good opportunity to talk a little bit about the c3-Sicilian, one of the most common Sicilian sidelines, and why it might not really be the best opening for everyone. So this game was submitted by DeanG, who's around 1600 playing white here, against a much higher rated opponent who is almost 2000. And while I don't think Dean lost this game because of the opening, I think it definitely had much more to do with the middle gameplay. We will see white struggle out of the opening phase, early middle game, not really knowing what to do or having a concrete plan for their pieces. Now let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of playing one of these popular Sicilian sidelines like the c3-Sicilian or the Grand-Prix attack or the closed Sicilian. In general, I think you should play whatever openings you like and whatever openings that lead to the positions that you want to play, whether you're a more aggressive tactical player or perhaps a more positional strategic player. But I have found that a lot of people play some of these sidelines for what I would say is the wrong reason, especially the c3-Sicilian. I've seen a lot of players say they like this one because it's kind of simple, it's easy to play, there's like not a lot of theory, and it's pretty safe and solid overall. But my opinion on this opening is that actually the c3-Sicilian is quite an aggressive opening, and you need to be willing to play quite aggressively and quite ambitiously in order to fight for the initiative. Because what often happens in this opening is one of two things. Either black will play d5, which is one of the main moves here, and after e takes d5, queen takes d5, eventually white is going to be playing d4 and leaving themselves with an isolated queen pawn. And of course the IQP is a long-term strategic weakness. So if you're not able to follow this up with very active play from white's point of view, you're just going to end up strategically worse here, and that's not really fun for anyone, especially when you're playing against a higher rated opponent who's just going to grind you down. And of course the other main line for black is to play knight of 6 here, which actually leads to a similar type of situation. White often plays e5 here. This is the typical move, and after knight to d5, this pawn on e5 often ends up being kind of a long-term strategic weakness from white's point of view. And once again, if white isn't able to follow up on this one with active play and really fighting for the attack and the initiative, a lot of times in these positions, white just ends up long-term strategically worse, and again, it's not a very fun position to play. So in my view, that's why I feel like the c3-Sicilian is not a great choice for a lot of players, because they're not quite equipped to follow up with really active and energetic play. That said, of course, it's a great opening, and lots of very strong players do play the c3-Sicilian. So if it does lead to the kinds of positions that you enjoy playing, then by all means, I think it's a great choice. And it goes for the Grand-Prix attack as well. I think the Grand-Prix, starting with knight c3 and f4, this is a pretty aggressive opening where you have to then play for the attack, play for the kingside attack. And if you're not willing to do that, then it's probably not going to be a good setup for you. When it comes to the closed Sicilian, I think this is kind of a nice hybrid choice. It's definitely a very safe weapon, and I think that's why a lot of beginners tend to like the closed Sicilian, because they can kind of avoid the confrontation for some time, slowly build up their position, and eventually decide whether they want to play for the kingside attack or play more positionally, more strategically. And so I don't have any huge qualms about the closed Sicilian. I think it's a very playable approach. In my opinion, it's not the most ambitious approach against the Sicilian, but if you're just looking to develop your pieces and avoid theory, as people like to do, and avoid really crazy complications out of the opening, I would say maybe that's a good balance between dynamic and strategic. So let's take a look at how the game progressed. White played c3, black played knight of 6, e5, knight d5, knight f3, black played e6, and here Dean goes g3. And at this point, Dean is pretty much out of book here, writes that they saw that the long diagonal would be open and decided just to test this move out, saying that, okay, this move looks natural, and yeah, Dean wants to put the bishop on g2. Now, this isn't the main way that white plays the opening, but I think this is actually a pretty viable approach whenever black goes for this kind of setup with e6 and d6. White might not be fighting for a huge advantage here, but it certainly is a way to get the pieces out. In general, white is playing d4, and after black plays something like cd4, and d6, we get one of these positions that I was referring to earlier, where eventually white is probably going to have to leave themselves with this kind of weak e5 pawn, and again is going to have to justify this with active play on the king side. And so the position is pretty double-edged. Instead, we see g3 in the game, which I would say actually does lead to a somewhat quieter position. Black plays d6, bishop g2, knight to d7. And here, this is where Dean starts to go a little bit wrong and plays the move d4. Now, d4 is a very natural move, but as a lot of c3-Sicilian players understand, generally you do want to take on d6 if you have a chance, so you're not left with this weak pawn on e5. So white goes d4 in the game, black plays c takes d4. Now Dean takes with the queen. I think this is another kind of inaccuracy. Probably would have been better to just go c d4 and recapture towards the center. But here, for example, after takes and takes, we get the structure where, again, white has this weak pawn on e5, and eventually black is going to try to put pressure on this weakness. And I think things are close to balance, but it's one of those positions that's kind of tough for white to play because, yeah, you do have to hold on to this pawn long term. So that's why I think white really should have gone for e takes d6 in this position. And then, for example, after bishop takes d6, let's say white castles first, black castles, and then white plays d4. Here I think white can actually fight for a small advantage, as the bishop on g2 definitely looks to be quite active. The position kind of resembles a Catalan opening, where white's bishop is just exerting this pressure against b7, and black really has to figure out what they're going to do with their light square bishop, as this piece is, of course, really underdeveloped. So I'd actually give white a little bit of an edge here and say that white would be doing totally fine. So white definitely could have gotten a very reasonable position out of this opening, but Dean wasn't familiar with this nuance of e takes d6, but that's why it's useful to analyze your games to pick up on these ideas and improve your play in the future. So in the game we get d4, c takes d4, and then here, like I mentioned, I think white should just recapture and try to keep as much control over the center with pawns as possible. Instead, we get queen takes d4, and Dean mentions in their notes that basically he missed it after takes, knight takes e5. Black has this nice move, bishop to c5. Developing the bishop with tempo, and of course making things awkward for white because the queen has to hold on to the knight on e5. And yeah, if not for this move, I would say white's play here is totally fine. For example, if black were to play knight takes e5 and trade here after queen takes e5, things would actually be a little bit uncomfortable for black. Even though white's queen seems a little bit exposed, it is putting pressure on the g7 pawn here, so black can't really play bishop to d6. And otherwise, white's bishop on g2 is a very nice piece, exerting pressure again along the whole diagonal, and white is ready to just castle, maybe play c4 one day, and I think white is doing quite well here. But unfortunately, this move, bishop to c5, gives black quite an active position. Now white plays queen e4 to hold on to the knight, black castles, white castles, queen to c7. Now white drops back knight to d3. I can kind of understand this move. I think white didn't want to trade and help black develop, but at the same time, after knight to d3 hitting the bishop, black eventually retreats this one. This knight on d3 doesn't feel like the most stable piece, so I think probably trading was a little bit better in this case. But anyway, we get knight d3, knight f6, hitting the queen, queen to h4. White has now lost a lot of time ever since queen takes d4, and black has gotten quite a few tempi with this one. Bishop e7 is played, and c4. And here black kind of does white a favor with the move knight to b4, allowing white to trade off the somewhat clumsy and hanging knight on d3. I think black should have played knight to b6 here, hitting the pawn, and then I imagine maybe white plays something like b3. I would play e5 here for black just to open up the light square bishop, and once black can get this bishop out, I think black is absolutely fine and really has no issues. Instead, we see knight to b4 here. Now white trades on b4, bishop takes b4, and a really instructive moment, Dean plays bishop to d2, consciously avoiding knight to c3 because he was worried about the potential double pawns. And yeah, I can imagine a lot of players not liking the move here for the same reason, but as Dean analyzed afterwards and mentions in his notes, it's actually quite a big deal for black to give up the dark square bishop here, and white gets total compensation for the double pawns in the power of the dark squares, because now this dark square bishop is unopposed, is pretty much going to dominate the board. If the bishop can get to d6, that is going to be absolutely devastating for black, and yeah, white's pieces are just kind of controlling everything. So white would actually have quite a serious advantage here, and this was definitely not something to shy away from. But it's interesting that both players, kind of like that position for black, because black put the bishop on b4, recapturing, and probably was going to take on c3, and then white avoids this one. So instead, Dean tries to play things solid, offers this exchange. Black declines with bishop to e7, which I think makes sense because now white's bishop on d2 isn't really so well placed. And then another offer of a trade, queen f4. I really don't like this move. And in the game Black played bishop to d6, I really couldn't figure out why e5 wasn't played here. Because to me this move looked so natural, like avoiding the queen trade, getting a tempo against the queen, and also opening up the light square bishop. I think if Black plays this one, Black is already doing quite well, maybe even much better here, as white has to hold on to this pawn, and yeah, Black's pieces are just coming out super fast. So I think what happens to Dean in this portion of the game is something that often happens when we're playing against a higher rated player. You know, we try to trade pieces, we try to keep the position solid, but slowly we end up giving up ground and end up making a lot of concessions when we do this, and I think that's kind of exactly what happens here. Because white plays bishop d2, definitely a passive move compared to just developing the knight actively with knight c3 and playing for knight to b5. Then queen f4, really just misplacing the queen, as now the queen is like blocking the bishop, all in the hopes of a queen trade. Again, I think Black would have been much better after e5. Bishop d6 is played, white goes back, bishop to d7, and anyway Black ends up getting a very nice position here, just getting all of the pieces out, and yeah, white just doesn't really have a lot of harmony in their position. So knight c3 is played, rook d8, rook d1, bishop to e5. Black here kind of starts outplaying their opponent. Rook b1, just trying to defend the pawn. A little bit passive, but understandable move. Bishop to c6, Black is just looking to trade off the defender around white's king, this fianchettoed bishop on g2, really important piece, definitely a good idea. White goes knight to b5, Black ends up taking on b5, c takes b5, and then rook to d4, and now Black starts to take over here. So now rook d4, queen g5, Black just doubles on the d file, white plays bishop f3, rook d3, and now bishop to e3. And white ends up giving a pawn here, but pretty much has to because of all the pressure. Rook takes d1 is played, and now bishop takes d1. I think this is a little bit optimistic here, as white is anyway just losing a pawn with bishop takes b2 because of the tactic. I think white definitely should have just played rook takes d1 and tried to trade off another pair of rooks. And even though white loses a pawn after rook takes b2, you know, white has the two bishops, and with queens on the board, it's really not easy to see how Black is going to win this one. With the queens on the board, Black always has to be careful around the king. They can't exactly just start pushing all of their pawns because that'll just open up a lot of possible weaknesses. So I think this would have given white the best chances to hold the position. Instead, after bishop takes d1, bishop takes b2, okay, white definitely should just keep the bishop here and play something like bishop b3 or bishop f3, and then white is down a pawn, but still Black would have a lot of work to do to win the game. But instead we see rook takes b2, which is definitely a critical mistake, trading the bishops, but giving Black just a very active position immediately. And now that white's light square bishop is gone, the king feels extremely weak here. So Black is now not only pawn up, but is also just better strategically because white's king has gotten so much weaker. So the game continues b6, rook to d2, white tries to trade. I think that makes sense from their point of view, not really a whole lot we can do. Black decides to trade as well, plays queen to d7. There's actually lots of ways for Black to play the position. They didn't have to trade pieces off. They could play against white's king and play for the attack. But Black decides just to go queen d7 and queen to d5, just forcing the queens off the board. I think it's a pretty practical decision because we end up getting this kind of endgame where Black is just a pawn up, no real weaknesses. The knight on d5 is super solid. Knights, of course, love having nice outpost squares, especially in the endgame. And yeah, Black is able to just convert this one pretty smoothly. Now white does get bishop to e5 and can play bishop to b8, but the problem is after king f8, Black's king gets in very quickly. So for example, bishop to b8 here, king e7, white can win the pawn back, but king to d6, Black's king is simply way too active here, and b6 pawn is well defended, but white's queen side is definitely going to fall as the bishop just can't hold on to these pawns. And so eventually Black is just going to have two extra pawns in the position, and yeah, totally winning endgame. So Dean tries to fight on here, but doesn't really have a lot of chances, ends up going for this one, and then plays f5 here. Black had a number of choices, I think, can take this pawn or push e5, decides to play king to c7 in order to trap the bishop. It looks a little bit scary. The game gets a little wild here with f takes c6 and bishop takes b6, but eventually black is able to win this one, as black is able to just kind of defend against all the pawns, slowly round them up one by one, and yeah, eventually win the endgame. I think white could have maybe put up a little bit better resistance here, but I looked at it a little bit and it's pretty tough. But yeah, the game went on for a little bit after g4, f4, takes. Black had this protected pass pawn, which is just a very serious asset, and was able to just kind of slowly maneuver around and yeah, pick up all the pawns and eventually win the game. So tough game for white here, and as we saw, it definitely wasn't just because of the opening that they ended up losing. There were some very specific middle game mistakes that were made, but we did see a real uncertainty and yeah, not being sure what to do right out of the opening and in the early middle game, which is what happens to a lot of players when they pick up some of these sidelines. They don't really know them too well. They're just looking for something easy and safe to play, but they don't really know how to actually properly play the opening from there. So my advice, be very thoughtful about the lines you choose to play. Try to choose openings that you actually like, where you know what the upside is and what you're playing for. Are you playing an aggressive line and you're going to continue to play for the attack and the initiative, or are you playing a quieter approach and you're not looking to go crazy from the opening, but rather slowly build up and eventually take more space? So long story short, it's really important to understand what you're playing for in the opening, what the position demands of you, and then being willing to follow up properly in the game. I hope that was useful advice for you guys. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please make sure to do that as well. We really do appreciate it. All right, guys, hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.